All right. With all of that said, let's go ahead and transition to our best picture movie series as we get into Billy Wilder's The Lost Weekend, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture, obviously, in 1945. Is that where we're at now?
I know the
45?
film came out in 45.
The Oscar
45.
year of 1945.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and jump into this. I'm very excited for this.
Yeah.
Actually, before we do, just round robin. All of us have seen this film before, right? And this isn't a
Yes.
first time watch for anybody.
Correct.
No, unlike a lot of the other ones in this series, JD, this is not a first time watch.
Yeah,
It's
not
funny,
A
I don't-
first time watch. Yeah.
Not a first time for me either. I don't know why I initially watched it. Like this is probably one of the earliest Best Picture winners I had seen young. I don't know why I saw it young, but I did.
Yeah. I forget when it was when I first saw it. There was a point when I was really getting into film, and I think this is around the time I first joined In Session Film. So this was maybe 10 years ago. I had checked it out. I was kind of on a director's kick, looking at past directors that are known as being some of the greatest of all time. And I was kind of on a Billy Wilder kick for a little while. And I think this is where I checked out this film, specifically alongside movies like Ace in the Hole and Sunset Boulevard and The Apartment, Some Like It Hot, all of those movies.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I saw this for the first time. I believe, I don't know. It might have been one of those college experiences.
Okay.
And then, like you, Brennan, like a few years ago, I got into a Wilder kick as well. Maybe it was because Jay and Ryan, I believe, did a series on Billy Wilder.
They did.
If my memory,
yeah.
if memory serves.
And I think that was around the time of the pandemic, if I'm not mistaken. I think they were doing that around 2020, maybe 2021 at the very latest. And of course, we always tried to watch a lot of those films alongside them, so then we could join the fun and review them our own in the middle of the main show anyway.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
did
We
the
would
same
always
thing.
have something fun to say. And I want to say I caught up with a bunch of Wilder films during that series, The Lost Weekend being one of them. So I have seen this somewhat recently, but was excited to jump into it again.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and get into it. So it's, of course, directed by Billy Wilder. It stars Ray Milland, Jane Wyman, Philip Terry, Howard De Silva, Doris Dowling, and a bunch of others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with The Lost Weekend, it is the desperate life of a chronic alcoholic as we follow him through a 4-day drinking bout. It says here. Okay, Ben, we'll start with you, my friend. What do you think about The Lost Weekend?
I think it's definitely that fun little in between of like, oh man, do you remember this Best Picture winner that's like a classic? And just like, oh, but there's this other list that's like underrated. It's kind of the in between of that, where you're like, really good movie. But like
the line a bit, yeah.
It really straddles the line of like it's not underrated, and it's not like you don't look at this lineup and go, oh, bad winner. Like no, good winner, good film. What like a film that holds up. It's a funny, like it's so funny listening to you guys talk last week about Going My Way, about how it fits in the 40s.
Yeah,
because you were talking specifically about Mrs. Miniver and Casablanca and the war.
Yeah.
The look of that. And then they go Going My Way is the exact opposite reaction to the war.
Yeah.
And then the war's over. So now we can be sad again. So let's go into
now it's like, oh, now we can drink.
Now we can drink.
Everyone's coming home.
Everyone's coming home. I tell you what, guys, we're going dark. And it's like it's essentially the first time since like Rebecca they've had a chance to really like get into the depths of okay, guys, things aren't going great for everybody, and even at the end of this, it's not sunshine and rainbows. At the end of this, like it's a little bit of hopefulness, but at the same time, like I think it's a very, very well done film. It's I don't consider it like the best of all time. I think this is much more a performance film than a performance showcase of Milan than anything else.
Yeah.
It is a like. I see Milan as one of the all-time winners more than I see The Lost Weekend as one of the all-time best pictures. That's kind of how I always view it as.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think that's a very fair point. And I sort of feel the same way, looking at just Billy Wilder's films in particular. I don't think The Lost Weekend is one of his very best. I would certainly prefer movies like The Apartment or Double Indemnity, even to some extent, Some Like It Hot. But I think those movies have more to say in some ways. Like The Lost Weekend is a pretty, at least nowadays through the lens of 2024, it's a pretty simple film because we've had so many movies about addiction that are clearly owing a debt of gratitude towards The Lost Weekend. And I think that's what makes the movie so special is when we look at it in the context of this movie series in the 1940s specifically, what made these movies fascinating is not just how forward thinking that they were, but what they were choosing to do at the time that may have seemed a little bit taboo. Because The Lost Weekend is kind of a first movie of its kind to really tackle really addiction in a general way. It doesn't just have to be alcoholism, which this movie is about, but addiction in a way that is this bleak and this horrific. I mean, watching this again, I couldn't help but think of, and this is a bad comparison because I think The Lost Weekend is a much better movie, but I couldn't help but think of Darren Aronofsky's The Whale. In some ways, just as opposed to alcoholism, that movie depicts food as a form of like a vice for addiction. But they do have similar, I guess, tactics and how they try to visualize it in a very horrific way that could come off as blunt force trauma, if you want to say. Like there is an obviousness to this movie that makes it pretty simple when compared to other films that may have won Best Picture in the 1940s. But it is a very well done film and probably the closest that Billy Wilder has ever come to making a full on horror film. There are some images here that are pretty horrific, some hallucinatory things in the back.
The bat and the spider.
Oh yeah.
Oh man.
It kind of reminded me of like these like hallucinatory thrillers by like Roman Polanski in the 1960s. I was actually thinking a lot about Repulsion. I like the arms coming through the walls and things like that. It just had this almost gothic quality to it that I've always liked about the film, but I responded to it even more so thinking about it as a 1940s film, which I think is very visceral and very interesting. So I do think it's a very good film in that regard. But what makes it so, I guess, rewatchable, if anything, it is Ray Milland's performance. It really is a great performance. And I agree with you, Ben. I think the way you put it is so apt here that it's maybe a better Best Actor representation as opposed to a Best Picture winner. But I think as a showcase for a performance, it really is something special. And I've always liked Ray Milland as a performer. I think the first thing I ever saw him in was Alfred Hitchcock's Dial M for Murder. And even then I was like, I could not take my eyes off this guy. He's got this slimy, but almost kind of funny way about him that seems to suggest deeper rooted issues, which is a very difficult thing to do. So I think his performance is very good, certainly carries this thing, but there's a lot of good snappy dialogue here. The script is very on point. And I do like a lot of Wilder's filmmaking, even if I do think he may have honed his craft a little bit better in other films. But as a representation of movies that won Best Picture in the 1940s, I really like this one, especially given how bold and visceral it was for its time.
Yeah, I quite love this film as well. And I think the first thing that came to mind for me, especially in context of this series, is that it remedies the issue that we see with the Academy often where a director or an artist loses for something they should have won, and so they're awarded later for something that is maybe not their greatest works, but we have to make up for it. Double Indemnity should have won for Best Picture in 1944. It doesn't. So they make up for it a year later with The Lost Weekend. But thankfully, this isn't one of those victims where it's not great, but they award him anyway. This is still a very good movie. It's not, they did not Scorsese this. So kudos to the Academy.
We're going to get some Departed fans hating us right now.
Maybe so. That's perfectly fine. I haven't seen everything that came out in 1945, but I think The Lost Weekend is still a worthy winner. This is a really good film for a lot of the reasons you guys are talking about. It is a harrowing depiction of addiction. It is a first of its kind, especially when it ciphers that addiction through the prism of empathy for its central figure, something that
it's a good point.
we've never really seen before at that time. And Billy Wilder does not pull his punches. I love that he really goes out of his way to depict Don the way he does, and we do see him completely devolve as the addiction really gets its stranglehold on him. But
Yeah.
what I also love about the film is that it's not just about alcoholism, it's also about the frustrations of a man who feels completely unremarkable and has this inability to get past these demons. And we see how his failures constantly tease him. And so he continues to find refuge in alcohol. And I love how we see that dichotomy swing in just about every scene of the film. And perhaps brilliantly, where Billy Wilder, I think, really comes to play here. I think his direction is great. The cinematography at times is actually
Really directs
quite
the hell out of this thing. Yeah.
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 But the writing here, I think, is maybe where he shines the most.
I
Because
agree. I agree.
This is a film about a writer who struggles to find a way to write and feels as if he's already peaked in life, which leads to him drinking. So it becomes this circle that is a thematic crux throughout the film. I'm sure we'll get into as the film goes. But
Yeah,
there are
yeah.
moments here where Don finds himself in dialogue with other characters, and what he says is actually quite poetic. It's incredible how the dialogue is so well
Yeah.
written to
quite
demonstrate that
relatable.
he could be
Very.
a really good writer. Like
Yeah.
there's a moment in this film where he says, I believe he's talking to Helen here, or maybe he's talking to Nat, but he says, love is the hardest thing in the world to write about. It's so simple. You've got to catch it through the details, like the early morning sunlight hitting the gray tin of the rain spout in front of the house, the ringing of a telephone that sounds like Beethoven's Pastoral, a letter scribbled on her office stationery that you can carry around in your pocket because it smells like all of the lilacs in Ohio.
That's sharp. That's sharp writing there.
really incredible, astute line of dialogue that maybe if is hard to believe it comes from a drunk, but it comes from someone who has the ability to articulate that way. It's in him. He just can't put it from his words to the pen to the paper.
And that line
that's
gets
where his identity crisis it comes from. And so there is something to really support that circle. It's not just about depicting a man struggling with alcoholism just because.
And that line gets a callback later at the end of the
Yeah.
movie when the guy is like, "Oh, it smells like lilacs," like,
Yeah.
and it's like, "Oh," and like you said, the full circle of it all. It's never.
It's perfect in that way because one thing I like in addition to that, and you're talking about this, JD, the film doesn't go out of its way to suggest that this man is not without redeeming qualities. Like it actually showcases that he is a very capable artist, or specifically a writer in this regard. So he actually has credibility, and that is a very good thing to have to juxtapose the negativity that surrounds him and the bad choices that he is making and how that's fueling his choices. It really is a movie about an artist that has peaked too early. And that is something that does happen. I, for full disclosure, I am a musician and I play in a band here in the Philadelphia area, but I've networked with and met a lot of groups that may have had some type of hit way early in life, and all of a sudden they realized they weren't able to sustain it, but they still are talented. They're very talented, but the competitive nature of this world, just the fact that you peak so early in some type of thing that you are good at, that can really stifle a person, and you will resort to maybe some type of vice just to get by. I mean, you not will. Some people might not, but at the same time, I like that this film doesn't discredit Don as someone that is capable of doing some type of job. He still has those skills. He just found himself in the most unfortunate of circumstances.
Yeah, it's really like it's a film you don't really expect to have the poignancy it does. Like you kind of think of like I pointed back to this, like, is this the first message film? Like it doesn't even necessarily, like, the really interesting thing this film does. It's not like alcohol's evil. It never says that.
No.
It never, like,
Yeah.
it's like, obviously the alcohol is the problem for Don throughout this entire thing, obviously. But
Yeah.
that's not the point that everything's trying to be made. The point is this guy is he can't write, so he drinks, and he drinks because he can't write, and it's a vicious circle that'll never get through. And that's the same thing about this. You're talking about the love of the exquisiteness of the script. You're talking about that circle. He talks about that to the bartender, saying, "Don't wipe it away. Let me have my little vicious circle."
Exactly.
The circle is the perfect geometrical figure, no end, no beginning. And that's his existence. There's no
that dialogue.
He doesn't start drinking. He doesn't end drinking. He's always drinking. He's never sober, because he's like, there's never a, when does it stop? It's like, it never stops. When did it start? It never started. It was always there.
He speaks to later on in the film, right? When he shows back up at Nat's, and and Nat's like, "Weren't you already drinking last night?" And he's like, "Yes, I was, but it's medicine in the morning."
Yeah.
So it's something he constantly has to cling on to.
You drink to get drunk, and when you're drunk, you wake up hungover, and you have to drink to get rid of the hangover.
Yeah.
Then you're drunk. It's the mowing the grass so you can water the grass, so the grass can grow so you can mow it. It's
the serpent eating its own tail. It's an Ouroboros, like we talked about before, the Furiosa.
Yes. It always comes back to Furiosa with you guys. I swear.
Great movie. But I do like how Billy Wilder, as a director, is able to visualize that in really interesting ways. He hones in on those warm, wet circles at the bar and how they gradually get more bountiful, right? Showcasing the amount of drinks that Don has had. There's even a great shot of what looks like a camera basically drowning itself in one of these rye-filled glasses, which is it's an artistic touch that almost reminded me of the snow globe from Citizen Kane in a weird way. So like kind of putting its subject within the confines of the object. I love the way that it handles that really well. And going back to the writing, one thing I really appreciated about this film, and I noticed this now in a rewatch, there is no exposition to set up this world.
Nope.
It throws us right in it. It trusts the audience so beautifully. And it's not until maybe the 10-minute mark until we as an audience really start to get the full picture of what's going on. We hear a vagueness in these conversations, but that's what makes the conversations themselves feel more natural. They don't feel the need to explain things in a way that feel out of character just for the audience's sake. And I love how there's a level of trust that this movie has in us as viewers to fill in the blanks when the right time comes, and those times do come.
Absolutely.
I think it's really interesting how the two main supporting characters of Helen and Wick are kind of on the opposite sides of the spectrum of, like, they both understand that Don's at this point in his life, but how they're like the exasperation and going, "I'm done with this, and I'm never going to be done with this." Like that, and you can essentially, as the audience, empathize with either the one side or the other, and it's like that. There's automatically something to cling to. Neither one are ever seen as a bad person. It's like they're so fed up with all of this, like and like you said, we do not have much context. Even the flashbacks is just like the Don and Helen relationship, and it's more just and that's him recounting a story. Like, we don't know how much Wick has had to put up with, and all the crap he's had to deal with, and like there's the added context without needing the context. And like you said, the thing Wilder does about trusting that the audience knows what's going on and allowing them the leverage to be like, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think it speaks to action and the way we see it unravel on screen. The writing is certainly a big part of it as well. Wick does say something in those opening scenes about how this has been a struggle for years and that he's fed up. And that's a line of dialogue that could simply ring out as something that is told to us. But what is the first thing that happens in this film is that Don tries to swindle his brother and Helen into a circumstance where he could be alone in the apartment because he knows he has a bottle out the window. And that gives weight to Wick and what he had said about his brother. Yeah. So there is this incredible marriage between writing and what the characters actually do. And I love how that balance is woven throughout the film. So you do come to understand why Wick simply wants to give up on him. I'm done
Right.
with this. I've tried. And even in those opening scenes, he still shows him some empathy and some patience despite all of the lies and deceiving that Don does throughout the film. And I think while there is a contrast between Wick and Helen, I think what's fascinating about those two characters is that they're both extremely understandable. I don't think you can
Yeah.
really blame Wick for feeling the way he does, given that Don is constantly deceiving Wick and himself and really everyone in this film. But Helen does love him to the bitter end. And there is something noble about that. And I think it makes her actions in the end all the more powerful and heroic, the love and patience that she shows him. But I do think the film gets to have its cake and eat it too, in the sense that Wick, I don't think he comes off as an antagonist here or someone that we don't empathize with as well. Like
Right.
both of those characters and the actions they choose, despite being on opposite ends of the spectrum, are very understandable.
Yeah.
And to me, that's where the nuance of this film
because
lies.
it makes you think, how do people in their own lives deal with someone close to them going through a similar situation? The film is just about Wick. They're just as much about Wick and Helen as it is about Don. It's not just about Don's unraveling, but it's also about how those close to someone battling addiction, how
Yeah.
they integrate that within their own lives. And it raises some pretty interesting questions. Like, do they try and find a way out for selfish reasons, and can you blame them for that? Do they feel like they're stuck and they are obligated to help, or do they genuinely want to help? And I think the film, maybe indirectly, even if it's not very much about these things, it sort of forces us as audience members to think about it from their perspective and then therefore ask those questions. Because I think that makes their respective arcs just as interesting. You could tell a full story from their perspective, and I think there's still an interesting movie there. It just like the idea of how people who are dealing with this in an indirect way, someone in their life is going through this, how do they battle that, and how do they compartmentalize that for themselves in order for their own psychology to be as safely in tune as it is?
And I think of it the same way with the other characters too. Like
Yeah.
you look at like Gloria and Nat or Bim, the wardeners. You're like they all have their own roles with their different perspectives. Like you can tell Nat does not enjoy what he's doing. You can tell he doesn't want to be a part of this self-destruction. And he's he very much could have been like the wise bartender who knows too much, but he has a level of groundedness that is not really like what's the line? One's too many and a million's not enough. Like he
something like
knows
that,
exactly what's going on, but he has to enable him because that's his job. That's what he has
It's his
to do.
job. At the same time, you could tell as
He
a
doesn't want
person,
to.
he is wondering to himself, and it's all through gestures, it's all through eye contact. Am I indirectly complicit in this person's downfall now?
Yes.
And I think that's an interesting thing.
And then you have like Gloria, who is essentially Helen at the beginning of the relationship. Like maybe you can get Helen to you can get to the point where you're like, I've put up with this guy's crap a million times, but I've only put up with it once right now. Like, but it's the start of that. And they give Gloria way more humanity than you should. And then you get like Bim, who's like, is borderline like, oh, he's like a spooky guy trying to tell him that, but he's just being honest. And he's like, I've seen it. I know the truth. I know you're an alcoholic. I know all these guys are alcoholics. I know what this is. I'm not talking out of my ass here. Like this is, I have the experience. Listen to my experience. You're not going to listen to my experience. I know that, but here's like it. Any film that has more than has a passing character with that much depth and characterization, I'm always like, this is a well-written film.
Yeah, I'm with you
for sure. Speaking of, I want to talk about my favorite scene in the film. And it's this moment that I simply dub Don's pity party. And this comes about halfway through the film. And to me, I think this is Don at his lowest. To me, this is the lowest of lows. And this is in addition to what we see throughout the film where he's obviously deceiving everyone around him. At one point, he steals a woman's purse. He steals $10 from the nanny or whoever that character is early on. When she comes to the apartment to get her money, he ends up in the hospital, as you're talking about there, Ben. And despite all of that, I feel like this pity party is him at his low, and it comes in the context of a rant that he goes on where he says something to the effect of, when I was in college, I passed for a genius. They couldn't get the college magazine out without one of my stories. Boy, I was hot. Hemingway stuff. I reached my peak when I was 19, sold a piece to the Atlantic Monthly, reprinted in the Reader's Digest. Who wants to stay in college when he's Hemingway? That rant there, I think, says so much about where he is now currently, why he has this low self-esteem, and why he has to report to alcohol. And as he goes on and he continues to rant to Helen, he's just having a hard time. I'm 33. I haven't done anything.
Oh,
I'm
JD, you're such a
living
good
off
actor. You know that?
charity
Maybe,
of my
maybe
brother.
when we
Woe
remake
is
The Lost
me.
Weekend, I'll cast you in it.
Thank you. I'll do it just like that. I'm having such a hard time, guys. And so, even though I have a house and, I'm not dead, like there are a lot of people that have it worse. And maybe that's also where the context of the time perhaps heightens this, because, the war ended in 1945, but obviously there were a lot of people involved in that has it way harder than Don does. Okay.
Yeah.
He's living in New York. He has his brother. He has Helen. He still has a place to live. It's not like he's homeless, and
Right.
like things could be much worse for Don.
Oh, yeah.
I'll just put it that way. Which is why this pity party, to me, I kind of mock it and make fun, but to me, that's what makes the scene striking, is that in context of his life, and especially of the time, it's not as bad as he makes it out to be. Although, not to diminish alcoholism, obviously that is a significant problem that really does ruin people's lives. But and we do see that it does get worse for Don in that regard, even as this film goes. But here's a moment where we see the root of it. Like, we're at the root cause of why he's clinging to the bottle. So it's not even how the bottle makes him react overtly. There is a harrowing nature to that, as we talked about already. But what I love about this pity party is that we've gotten to the nucleus. We see the electricity. We see the protons moving. Like, this is who Don is at his core. This is ultimately why he chooses what he does. And I think the performance in that moment from Milan is great, because despite everything else we see, I feel like that's the most unlikable he is in that whole movie. Like, that's the moment where I almost don't care about you as a character. Even though I see you steal later on, I see you drink yourself silly that you have to go to the hospital. You treat all of these characters horribly, as you're talking about there, Ben. And yet, I feel like that's him at his lowest. That to me is when he's his most unlikable. Because that's when he's exposed the most. All of these other things are just symptoms of that pity party and what comes out there.
Yeah, it's not only when he's most exposed, but when he is doing something that maybe a lot of people who are battling addiction probably go through at some phase during the process, is that they find ways to not necessarily blame themselves, that there are other circumstances that are complicit in their unraveling. And there's some good dramatic irony in the way that it plays out here with The Lost Weekend, because we as an audience know that this is ultimately Don's fault, even though he is not willing to admit it in this moment necessarily. And I think that's where the lowest of the low comes into play. And even that unraveling that he starts to have physically, like, there is something. I was almost about to use the word funny, and I don't know if that is the right word, but it is heightened to such a degree that it almost feels farcical in a way. But I think that also plays into what we're talking about here, that his own his own downfall is maybe his own fault, and that he is heightening it to a degree that might not even be the most accurate representation of what it should be. So like it basically mirrors it from his own perspective as how bad things have gotten because of surrounding things that also continue to fuel it. So I think it's an interesting way of putting us in his in his line of sight and looking at it from his point of view. And that's I think that's what assists the movie in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I view it as like a testament to Wilder and Milan being on such the same page about what alcoholism means to Don, about what that means as far as like Don has to adjust every single conversation and every single thing he does to manipulate, to exaggerate, to charm, do whatever he can to get a drink. And in that situation, he is trying to get pity. And if he gets the pity, then
he is the greatest salesman.
He's the greatest salesman. Exactly. And that's the thing I find the best about Milan's performance. Is very very like a chameleon. Like he is charm incarnate. He will make the moves on Gloria, and Gloria falls for it. He will be pityful towards Nat and try to get his drink. He goes into that liquor store and friggin' puts the screws on that guy, and that guy goes, "I am terrified. I'm giving this guy a drink." Like,
you push him into a corner and he gets intimidated.
He has, like you said, it really, and that entire characterization is such where you're like, this guy has talent. He has all these things going for him. He has these abilities, the charisma, the ability to tell a story, the relationship building, all these things. He can do other stuff than this. His life is just so wrapped up into getting his next drink. That's all he can focus on, and that's all he cares about. Everything else be damned.
Yeah. Which is what's interesting about even the flashback scene when he first meets Helen, and Wilder shows us that he is constantly thirsting and can't even sit there for, I don't know, 2 hours, whatever a show would be. He has to leave, and that desperation still seeps out there. And I think it is also interesting, Helen there, because I love that interaction they have where they exchange the coats, and she's like, "Can I have my umbrella?" And he just simply
flings it on the ground. It was like,
doesn't he say catch? I think he yells catch to her. It's
like, you would talk about a guy who was not trying to get this girl in bed. Like he's I know what's in the pocket, and that's all I care about.
And somehow he still succeeds.
And somehow, and like it says a lot about her that she sees that and shows immediate empathy that there's something wrong with this guy, and maybe you're right, Ben. There's something about the charm that she just can't escape. And that he's able to lay out when he can. But I mean, you see the mechanics working in every moment. Even that moment, how can I find the next drink? Like that whole sequence ends with, well, I'm walking away home bottleless because it dropped on the ground. Wait, you said something about a party, right? What kind of party are we talking about?
Yeah, what a tricky man. What a tricky man. And you were right, Ben, about calling his performance committed, because apparently in real life, I think Ray Milland checked himself into a hospital in order to actually understand the experience of what the drunk ward was like from a real-time standpoint, and interacted with real doctors at the time too, so he could really do his research. And a lot of great actors do things like that, but you could tell there is that synergy from material to actor and then director, as you're talking about. There are a lot of people on the same page for sure.
And even like I remember them like, and I was reading a bit about it, and Milan doesn't like to drink. He said he doesn't like. He tried to kind of get into the role and just made him sick. Like he's like, okay, I have to actually, he can't just be like, I have to act drunk. It's not.
A performance is good when it makes you want to look at that actor's life story and think, "Man, I wonder if
Yeah.
alcohol really killed this person."
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
wasn't. I mean, that wasn't the case for Ray Milland. I think he had lung cancer and died at the age of 79, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
But yeah, that point about him not even really liking alcohol is just such an ironic thing.
Yeah.
But that's how a good actor is able to invest themselves and educate themselves in a role like this.
And I think it really speaks to, I can't say, I don't know who was necessarily responsible for the casting of Ray Milland, but he's by no means the obvious choice for this.
Yeah.
He is not the movie star at the time.
I think what happened was a lot of actors passed because executives, producers in Hollywood were saying this is a role that will end your career. So a ton of leading actors of the time passed on it, where Ray Milland decided, all right, I'm going to take the risk anyway.
I mean, I could see that because apparently I have the IMDb trivia open right now as we're talking, because I'm trying to look at things that correlate to some of the things we're talking about that could be relevant to this conversation. But if that is true, then it would make sense, because apparently the liquor industry did not want this movie to be released.
I read that
and
too,
if that was the talking point, then I could see how PR people or agents representing certain performers would probably say this is too damning of a project. We don't recommend this one.
Yeah. I don't know if it's true or not, but I think I also read that there were certain industry leaders that tried to buy Wilder out for this movie to scrap it. Like they were going to pay him something like $5 million to just burn the film. And look,
so apparently the thing was that they offered the studio and the studio said no, and Wilder said, well, if they'd offered me, I would have just done it.
maybe that's
yeah. So I mean, it's not. I don't see this as like damning towards the liquor industry.
I don't either.
No.
I don't either. I think they do a really good job of individualizing the addiction, and I think that's why all of the writer stuff or the Don Pity party scene, like all of that, I think is really important in excavating that the drinking isn't because because alcohol is bad. There is something that is driving him to a vice.
Yeah.
And because he has these constant fears of failure and never reaching his potential, he's 33 and living off the charity of his brother, has accomplished nothing. Like that's what's driving the addiction. And the film does a really great job of crystallizing that in a way that is extremely vivid, obviously quite harrowing when you get to the back half of the film. And it becomes about Don. It's not about alcohol or the kind of alcohol or whatever the case is, whatever the alcohol industry leaders were concerned about. When you watch the film, all of that fizzles away pretty quickly. And we realize that Don is the problem here.
He's the problem. Yeah. The alcohol is not the reason for him being as stagnant as he is artistically. Like that is not the reason. If anything, it's maintaining that reason because of his dependency on it. But that is his choice. I mean, after watching this movie, I'm not going to stop drinking rye whiskey. I love rye whiskey. I'm still going to keep drinking rye. Well, it's not turning me away from
honestly, that. You guys were talking about it. You guys were talking about it earlier, and then we got onto something else. So I didn't really have a chance to comment. But I think that's what's really intriguing about the cinematography here is that Billy Wilder, as you talked about, Brendan, he superimposes images of the shot glasses to really fill out the frame and tap into the symbolism of Don's futility when we see the rings of condensation there on the bar. I absolutely love how that taps into, as Don put it, let me have my vicious cycle or circle rather. And all of that is effective. But I also think there's an interesting duality with how he emphasizes the shot glasses here, or how we get these close-ups on Don as he drinks the whiskey, which as the film goes, it's almost as if it becomes a life source for him. Like he's been in the desert for 40 years and is, needing a drink of water just to survive. And the way Wilder shoots those scenes, there is kind of this weird allure. Even though alcohol is a vice and it becomes a problem for Don here, though it's shot in a way where you also like have this evocative feeling of, oh, that's whiskey or that's bourbon.
Yeah.
Hell, I'm gonna go pour myself a shot. Like there's like a weird duality in that regard where it's alluring and also a massive problem here. Like you understand that duality with Don throughout the film, and it just speaks to his overall ambition with this movie.
It doesn't make you not want to drink. I don't want to be a writer anymore. But I mean,
well, and that's the great thing about this movie as well, with how it treats art. Like Don is a writer here and an artist who is struggling to create his art, and so he leans on the vice. Like, what does that say about an artist who needs a vice because he's struggling? I think that's a whole conversation to be had about this film.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think but I was just going to say it's just as much a movie about addiction as it is about art. I think they both work simultaneously very well.
Which is what I love, the dichotomy of Don the writer versus Don the drunk. That's a whole through line that we hear throughout the film. Yeah.
That just goes to show you, make sure to have all your success later in life. Like, don't peak early. Like,
don't peak at 19.
or take your time with it. You know, like there's never a stopping point. You're never too old to do anything. And I feel like that's a universal sentiment. That's not just a nowadays kind of thing with the social media age making it easier for anyone to do anything. But like if you time it right. Like, I mean, JD, this podcast, we've been doing it for 10 years. We're better than ever now. We didn't peak early. I think I'm glad we didn't peak early.
Yeah.
I'm really glad we didn't.
I don't think we peaked early, and I am absolutely going to end this podcast whenever it comes, whenever that day is here.
So that way we can't go back down, right? We
can't go back down, but the last show will absolutely be In Session Film, The Pity Party. That's exactly how this is going to end.
And you're going to have to talk in that voice the whole time.
Do you remember episode 133? It was so good. So many people listened to it. We got 44 downloads.
Exactly. Any final thoughts you guys have on The Lost Weekend?
Okay, I had to mention this because obviously listening to your Going My Way podcast, and coming right off of Double Indemnity, and even you mentioned earlier about how, they didn't give Billy Wilder anything at 44, so they had to give it to him at 45. I found this story. I don't like. It's a fun story, and it's to the point where it's such a good story. I don't care if it's real.
Okay,
but so at the 44 Oscars, Billy Wilder showed up with Double Indemnity there, and he's like, I don't know about you guys, I made the best movie of the year. I got all these awards in the bag. He went in confident, as he should. He made Double Indemnity. He's going against Going My Way. It's like, what's going to happen? So he goes in there as the night goes on. Going My Way is racking up awards, and it's with the same. Paramount made both films, so he realized how much the executives were excited and all are winning, and he's like, crap, he just gets more and more mad as Going My Way keeps winning more and more stuff. So best director comes up. Leo McCarey gets announced as best director. Billy Wilder sticks his foot out and trips him. And Billy Wilder, quote, Mr. McCarey stumbled perceptibly as he beamed. So McCarey wins best director. Going My Way wins best picture. And Billy Wilder's still pissed. So he goes outside and he's waiting for his car. And there's a big group and somebody's like, Mr. Wilder, how was it? And he's like, what the hell does the Academy Award mean, for God's sake? After all, Luis Rayner won it 2 times. Luis Rayner! And then got in his car and left.
Wow.
I love how Billy Wilder was someone that was never afraid to speak his truth. He was never afraid to.
Luis Rayner strays. I was like,
wow.
I have a friend who loves Luis Rayner, and I tell him that story way too often, just because.
It's incredible.
Yeah, like it, and it is funny, like what you said. You see 44, and you see Going My Way. After watching Double Indemnity and Going My Way, you're like, how's this work?
Yeah.
And then you see this, and it actually beats McCarey in the second time, and I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure he's.
That's a rivalry for the books if there ever was one, right there.
Man.
Yeah, it is.
I love
pretty
that.
wild.
That's amazing.
And as we noted earlier, The Bells of St. Mary's was even more successful than Going My Way.
Mhm.
But Billy Wilder got the best of them the second time around.
I wonder if McCary tried tripping him at
On the way.
at that ceremony.
You probably using his Oscar from 44 to stick it out and hit him in the
he stuck it
kneecap
out,
or something
yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the Woody Harrelson Zombieland clip of just like, oh yeah, McCary can dry his tears with his Oscar from the year before. Like, I think he'll be okay.
I think he'll be
Yeah.
fine.
Well, and it's also interesting. This is a deeper conversation than we really have time for now, but I just find it fascinating. We're going through all of these Best Picture winners, obviously, but the larger conversation of how much weight do we put on these awards? You know, because obviously you have something like Citizen Kane, which loses, and that's heralded as one of the best films of all time. And same thing with Double Indemnity, even more so than The Lost Weekend. That's a film that is heralded as one of the best films ever made. So Wilder certainly gets to have the last laugh in that regard, even if he never had the Oscar in hand, at least until the next year, but never for that movie.
Yeah.
And I find that fascinating here.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea because, like, I could make the case that Brokeback Mountain losing Best Picture is better for it.
Oh, Ben.
Like I'm not talking about
here.
I'm not talking about. I'm not saying it should have lost Best Picture. I'm saying as far as
no, like
anyway.
we're inching closer and closer to JD getting back on.
I
his
was just
soapbox.
going to say this soapbox finds a way to reappear in every damn episode now. It's because Ben, you are preaching to the choir. JD has said these very same things. He hasn't used Brokeback Mountain as the example, though.
No.
He's used other films as the example for exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, we have a T-shirt that we like to publicize as often as we can on our store that just says the best thing that ever happened to La La Land is that it lost Best Picture. Best thing that ever happened because of the same thing. Like the vitriol for La La Land disappeared immediately after it losing, and I'm glad that it does. I root so fervently every year that my favorite films do not win that award because every year it is inevitable.
I made the Austin Butler argument too. Like Austin Butler losing, good thing for him. Like but
absolutely.
Sometimes the right winner can win for the right thing that nobody cares about. Everybody's like, hey, Brendan Fraser has an Oscar. And everybody goes, yep. And then we can not have to worry about Brendan Fraser ever again.
And that's another crazy thing too, because pre The Whale, it seemed as if everyone was very pro Brendan Fraser because of everything that happened to him.
Yep.
We loved him. We are heartbroken for his Hollywood story.
Yeah.
And then The Whale comes out and everyone is like, oh my God, get this guy away from me. And it's like, just 2 minutes ago, we were all like rooting for the guy. Like, what happened here?
I remember the same thing happened with Allison Janney. Like 10 years before I, Tonya, if you said Allison Janney's going to have a steamroll Oscar win, everybody's like, yeah. And then that year happens. Everybody's like, this is an outrage. It's like,
I think people latch onto the idea of it. Then they
the idea of it than the actual execution. Like, it's like, but Laurie Metcalf. I'm like, okay, well, we still would have been having this conversation in some other time. I think they didn't happen with Laura Dern. Like the Laura Dern steamrolling. Everybody's like, Laura Dern's about to win an Oscar, and people are pissed. Like that doesn't make a ton of sense. Like you can't. You can't convince me.
Then you'll get the exceptions to that rule in the good way when a movie like Parasite just sweeps and everyone's like, that's what we want.
It's like, you remember when everything used to be nice, like Jane Fonda saying Parasite?
Yeah.
And then it was such a high, a month later, the world shut down. Like it was that level of, and it's so weird to have that kind of, that's why I think the Oscars are so interesting to me. That's why it always, you always have these type of things. Like, that's the cool thing about this podcast. Not to blow up y'all's heads a little more than it already is, but it's like getting into the nuts and bolts about like how many people these days are like, you know what, kind of like digging into Miss Miniver and the kind of the logistics of like World War II and England in and the US is not in, and that all that, and putting it into the terms of, like you said, I can't get off the, why did the world pick Going My Way as the best picture in the weirdest possible time? Like, it's so strange.
It's so
strange.
weird. Like, that was the most pivotal moment of the war. So much uncertainty still. And yet we're going after Casablanca. We're going with the film.
We're going this way.
Like, hey guys, the Battle of the Bulge just happened, and we don't know if your husbands are coming back. Father O'Malley, like, it's
so weird.
I think I said this during our review. The only guess I have, if I had to make any educated hypothesis, it's that, okay, now the war is so devastating, so bad. What is the most lighthearted way we can disengage from the horrors of World War II? Oh, Going My Way. Okay, this is the only way to separate yourself from it.
Yeah, it's like you look at the way back Oscars. Like, if you look at a Broadway melody and you're like, well, why did a Broadway melody win? It's like, well, audiences were so starved for anything that if it had any sort of sound and any sort of entertainment, they'd be show up for a B- High School Musical equivalent of a film, and they'll be like, well, if you're scratching that itch, no matter how much that itch sucks, if you're scratching that itch, we'll be like, yay, like, and that's kind of what you pointed to. It is. This is such an interesting run because it's always under the context of World War II, and all 5 of these films essentially are under that context with that in mind. And
we didn't really plan it that way. We picked the 40s because we thought, okay, we seem to have maybe the most blind spots. Maybe these are the most interesting films to start this series with. Yeah. And I think it just worked itself out that, historically speaking, it was one of the more interesting decades in Oscar history for those reasons.
And then, the next one, it's just hangover from that.
And exactly. I was just about to say, but the best years of our lives, we'll get to that next week. But absolutely. Well, I think with that, we'll go ahead and end the conversation here. This was a ton of fun. So if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say, if you're watching on YouTube, just leave a comment below. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or you can email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com.